Welcome to the Caring CEO, David.
Thanks, Graham. It's great to be here.
David, what does care in the workplace mean to you?
Graham, I think for me, it starts with employees having a clear understanding of the organization's purpose or its mission, its vision, where it aspires to go, and how that translates to the individual. Because I think unless the individual, and we're still employing humans in many cases and not robots, unless the employee, the individual person understands and can engage with that mission, that purpose, that vision, I don't think they can then commit to what the organization's asking of them in their particular role. And then I think from then on, there's just a mismatch or a misalignment between where the organization's going and what the individual understands their role to be and what's expected of them. And I think that's often at the heart of where you find people not working, not performing at work. And that is, I think, oftentimes the basis of issues with people's performance, and then people's health can suffer as a result if it's not clear what they're there to do, and it's not clear what's expected of them in terms of performance. It sounds so simple and basic, but I know that it's not the case in lots of organizations.
Yeah. You led Pearson for a long time in Australia and Asia Pacific. And I presume during that time there was an incredible transformation from books to digital and different ways to learn.
Mm.
Can you just give a bit more background about Pearson, and then about the challenges you had going from nice books you could hold and feel and look at to on a screen essentially, or in your ear or in your eyes sort of thing?
I was very fortunate to be at Pearson for the vast majority of my working life up to this point. Still working, but I'm working in more part-time capacities these days. I was very fortunate to be a part of an organization which has had a very bold and in some ways extravagant mission to help people make progress in their lives through learning. It's again, sounds simple, but complicated, and complicated in many ways because Pearson, as you say, began life a long time ago as a publisher of content, still does that. I left Pearson about 4 years ago now. When I joined Pearson, it was a publisher of textbooks for students at school and university, but realized that in order to understand how its mission could be fulfilled, it needed to be operating in a far more digital way. And as we know, print has been largely disrupted in many different sorts of environments. So, my role as the leader of the business in Australia and towards the end of my time across Asia was to figure out how we were going to transform the business in order to continue to be relevant, because our customers were saying to us, by not purchasing the things we were selling them or trying to sell them, what you're giving me as a learning product is not really what I'm looking for. So that was at the heart of the need to change the business, the need to transform the business. When that transformation started to get real in terms of impact on employees and our workforce, and that was hard because we built a workforce that had certain skills. We needed different skills. We needed different business models. So we established different sort of business units doing different things with different skill sets. But as you'd imagine, that created quite a cultural challenge because we had different people with some cases on different salaries because they were on roles that were needed to be competitive externally, but we had internal relativity to try and manage, which was complicated. So I could talk for hours about this, Graham. I think in the end, the transformation, measuring it in terms of revenue, the amount of revenue generated from digital and print was largely successful. We flipped around the percentage. I think when I started, it was all when we genuinely started on this transformation, it was something like 25% digital, 75% print, and we flipped that around completely by the time I left Pearson. And I did that with some very talented and committed colleagues, a great leadership team. I think we had to deal with those challenges around culture head on. These things are never straightforward. It's quite messy at times, but I think most people would say in the end they understood the reason for the change, and that we did our very best to try and respect and care for people, as that change turned up in job losses and so on.
Yeah. And Were people able to learn the new skills, or there were just people that couldn't make that transition?
A bit of both. So some people did learn new skills and were able to transition. Some people either didn't really want to or didn't have the ability. So there were people who had to leave the organization for those reasons, which was difficult. But we worked very hard at looking after people when they left the business, either as a result of their jobs being changed and restructured, or as a result of performance issues or their own election.
How did you create a shared future, with people that had it a certain way for a long period of time
Mm.
and suddenly there was an urgency to change?
We talked a lot about, it's one of those things in corporations that corporations adopt often languages that's not helpful when it comes to communicating to employees. Some employees don't really have any interest in the corporation. They've got an interest in what the corporation's doing. So when you hit them with the corporate speak, they tend to tune out. So we try very hard to rethink that corporate speak and represent it in terms of customers. So rather than saying revenue is falling, therefore we're making the following changes, we say our customers are not buying the products that we have designed to help them where they want to get to. They're just not buying them anymore, or not in the same numbers. So that was the first thing we tried. Then I think we really tried to help people understand things like market size, addressable market size. So if you're thinking about the Australian environment for textbooks, it was not a very big market. But if you looked at the market, for example, digital services to universities or English language testing, there's much more substantial markets. And as a part of a globally publicly listed company, of course, we had a responsibility to shareholders to try and grow the business as we could while managing all those competing. I think one of the things I learned through that experience was it's the old adage about communication. You need to do it again and again in different forums, and a combination of large groups and smaller groups, and formal and informal. And I think over time, one of my early mistakes was to assume that a few different pieces of communication and a few different settings was adequate. It wasn't. I then hear people saying to me, well, I just don't understand where we're going, or I don't understand why we're not investing as much in this great area over here. So we then just doubled our efforts and tried lots of different approaches.
You mentioned before, corporate speak and then translating it, I guess, to people speak or, employee speak. Can you think of an example of when you did that? What was the corporate speak and how did you then translate that to people speak?
Yeah, I think, and I don't even know whether I planned this, but I remember being in a meeting and talking about financial results. And I started off and I went through the key headlines in revenue and expenses and gross margin and operating profit. And so I remember looking around the room and seeing a sea of quite disengaged and disinterested faces. And I felt some frustration because I thought, why aren't they getting it? I've talked about these things for a long time and they're not getting it. And I think just in that moment, I said, look, we're over here building these products. People are not buying them. And that was a shock, because I think many in the group were people whose job it was to build products and build learning products. They're very proud of what they did. And they built great learning products, really well thought through, well designed, very engaging. But at the end of the day, doesn't matter. Most people are buying them in enough quantities. So, I think for me, that was a moment of insight for me, where I think after that point, I tried very hard and it wasn't a case of dumbing stuff down. It was just a case of representing information in ways that was understandable and actually connected with people.
You shared before we came on air that, your first year as CEO was a really tough year and great results weren't necessarily delivered. And you had a very good mentor and he asked you a key question. Would you mind telling the listeners about that?
Yes, so very grateful to my boss when I was made managing director of the Pearson Australia business. I reported to someone responsible for all of Pearson's businesses, and he got me involved with an external CEO organization, whose model was to have the chair of your group was your mentor, your coach. So I'd meet with my coach once a month for a couple of hours, and we had a very difficult year, my first full year as a CEO. And it's fair to say I was struggling. So we were having a meeting and I was running through the results and obviously expressing some frustration. And my coach John looked at me, and I'll never forget this. He looked at me and said, "David, what are the sanctions for poor performance in your organization?" Never forget it. It's more than 20 years ago. And I didn't have an answer, Grant. I didn't have a good answer. And I think at that point, my mental model for performance was really to put care and concern and respect first and then worry about performance later. It wasn't that I didn't understand the importance of good performance, but I think that sort of lit a fire in me of that I think the next 20 years I spent trying to figure out the right balance between care and performance and the relationship between a high care and high performance organization. But we really started then being much clearer with people and much more specific about what good performance looked like, what we expected of everyone, and married that with good feedback and clear and direct feedback. And it's I think my mental models got rewired through that question and through the ensuing work that we did with the business to think differently about performance.
It's an interesting word, isn't it? Sanction. We tend to think
Mm,
more in a trade situation. There's been lots of that playing out in Europe and those sort of areas now. But by sanction, did he mean, is there punishment for people that don't reach their performance goals?
correct.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was. What are the implications? What are the consequences in that instance?
What other questions did you find really helpful to use with your team to make sure they're on board or to hear if you've got any issues which they may not have spoken about?
I would, when I was feeling brave, I would ask my direct reports, what are the three things I do that really frustrate you? And if there's any of those colleagues listening, they'll probably have a chuckle because they'd probably say he didn't ask that question as much as I would have liked to. But I was genuinely wanting to create an environment where I was vulnerable, where I was asking them for feedback, but in a way, rather than just asking a very open question about what feedback do you have for me, to try and hone in on the things and to try and give them permission to say, well, when you do this, I find that frustrating. So we were able to have a more constructive and open conversation about that. I then hope that they would then take that question to their direct reports so that we create an environment where people feel they can speak out without risking, any other sort of negativity.
What were some of the important things you'd learned from asking those questions?
I think early on, following on from the performance conversation I mentioned a minute ago, I probably created a set of structures in the way I work with my direct reports that they felt a little bit too constricting. So my weekly catch-ups initially were quite heavily scripted or heavily structured. And I think I know they felt that was a little bit controlling. And, being a control freak is something I never wanted to do. They probably felt that I was initially too controlling and too wanting to be too involved in the specifics. I think I was trying to figure out what it meant to be a CEO, having been a line manager before, figuring out the step up to this role. How do you do that successfully? And what does it mean when you're not actually driving an individual business unit? You're not running sales and marketing. The structure was a series of business unit leaders. But look, after a bit of time and I think a bit of feedback back and forth, I relaxed a bit and figured out other ways that rather than just working through them, I could understand how their business unit was performing and see my role as a coach and a support rather than as an intervener. That makes sense.
I think I think I read this about, I think he was the human resource director of Google, and he recommended asking three questions. And it's usually those questions that he asks because the person that asks them gets a chance to feel okay. So the first question is, what am I doing regularly that's really helpful? Then what am I doing as well that you'd like me to do more of? And the third question is, what can I do differently to really increase your effectiveness and productivity? These can be very powerful, can't they? Because they really, and I know you would have learnt a lot about this in being a learning business, that questions asked help people to reflect and help people to decide what they want to focus on, and can uncover areas where we need to do things differently.
That's right. I think so. I would do a version of that. Sometimes I'd ask people, what do you want more of or less of from me? And I think they're critical questions, because unless we're showing, as I said before, showing some vulnerability and being open. And I think for me, I have a strong perfectionist drive. So letting go of that, which I'm not sure I have yet, but I'm a work in progress, letting go of that and admitting there are things I didn't know or was not so good at, and the others were much better at, learning how to then empower them to do things that they were good at that would help the business was something I tried to do as much as I could.
Managing all those stakeholders is not easy. I also suspect you had lots of travel you had to do, which can be very tiring in its own right. How do you keep fuel in your own tank? What do you do about your own personal self-care?
It's a very important question. I think having good exercise disciplines has always been good and important for me. So I always exercise regularly, whether it's just a 45-minute walk in the morning or a run or a gym session. It never ceases to amaze me how it can change your mood and your outlook, and therefore the version of you that shows up in the workplace to stressful situations. I would notice the difference if I'd done some exercise and been in a good headspace. Particularly, I think when you're traveling, I think to use the time to exercise was really important, because the combination of long hours, jet lag, coping with different cultures, and the stresses of logistics when traveling made all of that, the cumulative effect of all of that is pretty substantial. And then on top of that, you've got constant work calls and pressures of delivering results. I think exercise, you can see my guitars behind me on my wall, Graham, that your listeners won't be able to, but I'm a avid amateur musician, and that was a hugely important outlet for me, to have music and to have projects that keep me busy, and then family and friends, also very important.
What was your favorite music?
Look, it's very hard to choose favorite music, but I love Australian music. I love Paul Kelly, amongst lots of other wonderful music, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, some of my favorites. But there is a song by Paul Kelly that always moves me to tears. It's called Deeper Water. It's about the stories of images of kids on a beach with their dad in the surf. I've got strong memories of that from my own childhood. And it's a song of love and loss and death and life. And it's an incredible song. And I think the ability of music to not just move you through the music, but through the lyrics is something I find fascinating. And that song, just every single time, it moves me.
Yeah. It can really bring memories back, can't it? I remember I've recently, over the last 3 or 4 years, lost both my parents, but I never could, I'd always be surprised, but how hearing some music could just bring something back to them, something from their earlier life. And it has a remarkable capacity to do that, doesn't it?
And I guess when you hear that music now, it brings them all back. Their favorite music brings things back for you. Yeah,
that's absolutely. Yeah. You've been in the learning business a long time, and perhaps you would mind just sharing with the listeners as well what you've been doing since you've left Pearson.
Yeah, so initially I took some time out, so my role was made redundant. And so one of the things that lots of people, including Pearson's CEO at the time, said to me was, just make sure you take some time out. So I did that. I took some time out and sold a house and, moved where I lived, my wife and I. And then when I re-engaged, I started to talk to my network. And I think it's the old adage about your network is where opportunities arise. And it's certainly been the case for me in the last 4 years. So I've done a mix of things. I've done some advisory and strategic consulting type work with a couple of different organizations. I did an interim chief operating officer role at a university for 6 months, which I found fascinating, and that was a wonderful experience. And then I've taken on some non-executive roles, and that's, I think, where I'm feeling myself quite settled. So a range of non-executive roles. These days I'm chair of a couple of education organisations, and I'm on the board of a local school on the Central Coast, and I do some other mentoring work on the side as well. And I find that that mix now is good. It gives me a little bit of time for hobbies like music, but I'm actually quite busy with those roles. And it really, I think, so critical to have a sense of purpose and to have some things for me that bring me in touch with new colleagues in new organizational settings, again in education. So there's that connection for me having worked in education, but they're different sort of environments. So yeah, I've really enjoyed that.
Did you feel a sense of loss of identity when you finished your full-time role?
Yes, I did. And it took me, and I would say I'm still working through that. I would have dreams about Pearson.
Wow.
Pearson colleagues listening, you'll be laughing to hear that. But yeah, and I think for me, because I was there for a long period of time, perhaps not surprising that it took a while to unplug and let go. But I think the other thing is, even though the redundancy process was very well managed and sensitively by the company, and I was very grateful to the way I was treated very fairly. I'd always imagined that it'd be a great way to finish your career in getting redundancy and sort of, walking off with a golden parachute and all of that. But it was actually harder than I expected. I found it difficult. There was a reasonably long handover period. So being still employed but not relevant and not involved was really hard. Then when I left, it was just a constant process of dealing with the emotions around not having that role, not having that status anymore. And for a while, I really thought I should try and jump back into that. I had lunch with a former colleague who said to me, "Why do you want that? Why do you want that life? You've now got a life where you're working, but you've got time
Mm.
to yourself. You don't have to travel constantly. You're not on constant calls day and night." And she was right. She was
Mm.
absolutely right. So, but it is a process, and I think it's taught me a lot about myself and what other people go through in those experiences.
You mentioned previously about a boss a coach who asked a great question about sanctions and that sort of thing. You also mentioned that, you asked the people that reported you questions to get insight and to evolve more. What other important leaderships lessons did you get? Was there any one particular or a couple of books or TED Talks or experiences that were really insightful?
Yeah, there were. I'll talk about colleagues first. I work with some amazing colleagues. I learned a lot from them, and I have to give a shout out to my former HR colleague, Simone Wright. She and her team put together a wonderful program called Pearson Well, which really provided a framework that we thought about care in the workplace quite differently. So I was very fortunate, and many other great colleagues as well who gave great support, were great sounding boards for me. In terms of books, I've always loved Patrick Lencioni's work, and a couple of his books, Five Temptations of a CEO, I found incredibly insightful. And they're really, they're deceptively simple because he uses fables to illustrate his points. Five Dysfunctions of a Team was another really interesting one. And I think he's reflected a lot on dysfunctional and functional workplaces, and care comes through very strongly in his work and in his writing. And he's a marvelous speaker. One of the funniest and most entertaining speakers I think I've ever seen. But yeah, he particularly talked in that book, Five Dysfunctions of a Team, which is a story of a dysfunctional team. And one of the things is they don't do conflict. They can't do conflict in any kind of constructive way. They'll have it by the water cooler and it'll be toxic and all of that. And he talks about mining for conflict in a meeting. So if you're in a meeting and there's two colleagues who disagree, but they're not saying anything, bring it out, ask them a question that brings it out. And so I would try, I'm a naturally conflict averse person. So I still to this day, I'm better than I used to be, but I still have to practice that. But it's a really interesting example for me of care in the workplace to say, I know these two colleagues disagree. I'm going to bring that out in a way that's constructive and respectful and gives them both a chance to say their piece, and then we'll move on. Because I really find I've been very grateful to him as a writer because his stuff is so practical and yet, quite insightful.
What do you remember from the Five Temptations of a CEO? What really stood out there for you?
I think certainty versus clarity. And I think the temptation of a CEO to have every single piece of information and every single data point and every single before acting versus having enough clarity to make a decision and move on. And I actually, I use that a lot. And I think, Pearson was a workplace that was encouraging, risk-taking and supportive when things went wrong. And sometimes we made decisions with what we thought was enough clarity and we got it wrong. But I think that's very much the nature of successful businesses, is having that culture where it's okay, where you give them permission. Yes, you've got to learn from that mistake, but a lot of times that served us well, that approach.
I've read where Jeff Bezos from Amazon talks about the 70% rule. And basically, we can't ever have enough 100% information to make a decision. And if we wait till we do, it's probably too late.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
How do you judge whether it's enough or whether it's enough to move forward?
A lot of teamwork, a lot of team discussion and debate. And I think over time, when you work with colleagues, you learn to trust their judgment. You learn when they need a bit more, time, or there needs to be a bit more ventilating of an issue. But I think taking different soundings around the table or inside a management team of the business units that I ran, and I found that actually incredibly exciting and energizing, was to sit around the table with really bright people, brighter than I was in many ways, and to listen to them work through, I think, listening to the logic and the frameworks they were using to develop their point of view gave me confidence that actually we've thought this through to a level that's appropriate and we should just move on. And I think teams then develop a confidence in their own collective decision making that you as a leader can then, really trust. I think extending trust in that setting was important.
How do you build care, connection, and belonging? It's a fundamental human need to feel like we belong. Is that a conscious way to do that, or do you have, certain things that you try to practice each week to encourage that?
It's a combination of the informal, I would find out that a colleague was sick, or they had a sick partner or relative or someone who passed away. And I'd make it my point to personally contact that person and express my sympathy and support. And I know that people appreciate that. I had a lot of feedback that people appreciated that. I used to send handwritten notes to people in that instance or in other examples. So the informal, I think the formal, so I would talk about care a lot and the relationship between care and high performance a lot in my town hall meetings and in team meetings, because I wanted to give permission to the rest of the business to also talk about that. And then I think social events are really important. I think having fun together was really important. So my leadership team, we'd have a range of different meetings. We had a weekly check-in every Monday where we would just quickly go through what's everyone got on their plate for this week and are you green, amber, or red? So we'd put the week into a context of how are you going, where do you need help, and how can the team help you? So, and then we had regular other more substantial meetings and we did fun social things together as well. And I think not everyone in a workplace needs to buy into that. Not everyone wants to or has the capacity, but I think having those things available is important.
I love that green, amber, or red. As you may recall, I have a moodometer where I talk very much
I do, yeah.
about that. And I like it because it's a lower stigma to say you're in a zone rather than to say that you're really stressed or anxious or depressed or whatever. Did you find people were able to share if they were in the red zone, or was it more just sort of an amber zone, green zone?
Some more so than others. I think some struggled to open themselves up. But as we went along and as people saw colleagues saying, I'm red this week, I'm really struggling, I've got these 5 things, or I'm really not sure about this, or we're struggling in this part of the business. So I would say towards the end of my time leading that team, people were pretty open and honest with each other. Yeah.
It's great. You would have been, very aware. In fact, I read in various places, I can't remember exactly where, that, the whole concept of learner-centric training and education was so important. What exactly is that learner-centric training and how did it change training?
Yeah, it's a great question because The learner isn't always the person making the buying decision in the context of the businesses that I used to lead. So, for example, a high school student doesn't choose one science book from one publisher over another one. It's the choice is made by the teacher or by the school. In the case of the higher education services business that we set up, the decision to choose Pearson over the provider was made by the university, not by the individual learner. In fact, the individual learner enrolled in an online program didn't know about Pearson because it was a white label offering. So that's the first thing, because you couldn't just look at it through the mindset of the customer and say, how are we going to make the customer centric? So, we would take feedback from teachers. It's an example about the science textbook. We employed a lot of former teachers who understood pedagogy and how to construct engaging content, learning content, how that should be designed. So we considered that. We talked to, in the university example, we talked to the people delivering the training to understand how do we support these learners? How do we give them enough pastoral support so that they can access help when they need to? One of the other things we did at Pearson was we created a learning day where every single member of our business, we had 450 people across the region, could take one day a year for their own learning unrelated to work, just something. All they had to do was give us a brief report on what they did that day. So it could be doing a barista course or learning a new language or whatever it might be. And I think that process put learning much more. This is ironic given that we were a learning company, but a lot of the times we were thinking about building products to sell, not products to help people learn. So it was I think part of our transformation that we were trying to work through. And so we sort of tried to bring learning front and center in formal and informal ways, in fun ways, and in more serious ways, so that we did demystify it a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. What did you find people did learn about when they had that day off? Was it, if you had to split it into work-oriented, private-oriented, where do you think that balance fell?
Probably the majority was personal fun type things, but fun things that were also learning a language or learning a musical instrument. Some people did things related to their work. Maybe they learned how to put some time towards learning a computer language or learning how to use an computer application. So it really was genuinely a mix of different things.
Yeah. And on that topic of learner-centric, you shared with me earlier about your 28-year-old son. Would you mind just sort of sharing that story? I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, so I have a son, James, who's now 28, and James is severely intellectually disabled. He doesn't have a diagnosis, but since the age of about 2, we realized that he was intellectually disabled, and became apparent as he grew that his development was substantially behind his peers. So that was an incredibly challenging time. James is nonverbal, physically okay, but needs help to do everything, all the personal care and eating and so on he needs help with. And I think, I made an assumption because of his disability that James's capacity to learn was non-existent. And I was just amazed. And my wife has been, much more positive and optimistic about James in many ways than I have been. But I was amazed when we started teaching James some sign language, that over time he actually picked up some of those signs and in fact developed his own version of those signs that meant he could communicate to us. And then when the iPad arrived on the scene and he got his first iPad, I was absolutely amazed by his ability we didn't teach him how to use his iPad, but he can now sit with his iPad and he can flip through YouTube clips. He can navigate, he can swipe, he can point at a thumbnail and access the clip and watch the clip and use the device without a lot of help. And so the lesson for me was anyone can learn. Anyone can learn new things or new skills that help them communicate and get by in the world in their own way. And so it was a big lesson for me.
Yeah. I also remember watching, I think it was a YouTube video of the first day that Satya Nadella from Microsoft took on his role as CEO. And in that sort of presentation, he shared how he'd been able to access Microsoft resources to help his three kids. He had three kids with learning difficulties.
Oh,
And then he basically threw it out to, all the people watching him there and just saying, what problems do you have that Microsoft could help solve? And it's interesting that there's been a remarkable turnaround at Microsoft. It was once a very competitive company and didn't really partner. And that really turned around to having greater collaboration, but make it passionate about solving a problem that was really important to you. And I thought that was a great example of demonstrating purpose of
yeah,
a technology company.
definitely.
It's been wonderful catching up today, David. The time's gone very quickly.
Thank you, Graham.
But I'd like to end just on the question I always do, but which is, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
I mentioned earlier that I have a perfectionist streak, and I think sometimes that means that I'm not as curious or as open to new ideas or new experiences as I wish I was. And so I think I'd be saying to my 18-year-old self, be more curious, ask more questions, realize that you don't have all the answers, and perhaps I would have spent more time living in other parts of the world rather than just staying here, as has happened because of family reasons. I've needed to be here. But I think, yeah, I think I'd be more pushing myself to be more curious and more open.
Well, that's a wonderful quality we all should embrace, isn't it? Especially with the rate of change going on in the world. It's hard to keep up, but at least being conscious of it and making that decision, I think is, a very strong message for anyone. Thanks very much for being part of the Caring CEO. David, been lovely chatting with you.
Thank you, Graham. And can I just quickly say how wonderful your efforts have been in the area of raising awareness around mental health issues and strategies that companies can employ to support their employees and for the friends to support each other. I think Are You OK Day has been a wonderful initiative, and your willingness to step into that situation, often very vulnerably, Graham, is something that I know my colleagues and I at Pearson really valued and appreciated, and I know many other people do as well. So thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure, and it's very kind of you to say that. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham.